Well, hello, I am Stephanie Flanders, head of Bloomberg Economics and senior executive editor for economics at Bloomberg. And I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Dambisa Moyo, who occupies an unusual, I would say, unique position as not only a well known thinker, author of multiple books and macroeconomist, but also an active member of the board of at least two major global corporations right now and several before, Chevron and 3M. Her latest book, How Boards Work, is, I think it's many things, but it's a manual for anyone joining a corporate board. She says she wished she'd had it when she first started working on boards over a decade ago. But I would say it's also something of a call to arms for companies and their boards to do a better job of making use of their resources to grasp modern challenges. And I noticed that the book has only just come out, and presumably you were finalizing it just as COVID was making its mark on company strategies and certainly government policies worldwide. So I think there's plenty to talk about, but maybe we should start with that. Did the pandemic make you want to edit or change any of the conclusions in that book, or were there bits that you wish you'd written more about or put in bold type? How did it affect you?
Well, so first of all, thank you. I'm delighted to participate here. And I think it's a great question. There's no doubt that COVID and the global pandemic has catalyzed and accelerated a lot of issues that were already being debated in boardrooms. We were already worried about low growth. We were already worried about the impotence of public policy. If you remember, we were already in a negative interest rate environment in some major countries. We were already worried about the lack of investment in infrastructure. And of course, there was a whole suite of headwinds from climate change and income inequality to demographic shifts that were impacting both the quality and the quantity of the workforce, and indeed technology and the risk of a jobless underclass. These were all issues that were happening pre-COVID. So in that respect, COVID has essentially accelerated the timelines and made it even more important for boards to be focused on not just the short-term issues around financials and operations, which were really brought to the fore. How are we going to survive? Do we have enough capital? Do we know where our people are? Are people being treated? Do they have access to healthcare, et cetera? But also has brought really much to the fore the questions of longer-term strategic imperatives. What does the company do after COVID is hit? How are we going to, and in fact, post recovery, how does the company participate in this new world of ESG and stakeholder capitalism?
So what are I mean, I think there's so much there, and I know that you think that there are at least five big challenges facing companies. But if the big corporations that you've worked with and others that you see around you, what is the most pressing thing right now as we look for, we've got optimism about the recovery, but also a question mark about the future of work-life balance, the future of cities, all these things. Where do you start if you're a big global company?
Well, first of all, I would just say that, there's no doubt we're going to see a rebound this year. I mean, you've seen the Fed's new forecasts, look at China's forecast for growth this year. But I think we shouldn't delude ourselves into thinking that this is a fundamental recovery. We have not solved the debt problem that has gotten even bigger with the pandemic. We have not solved a lot of the structural problems that I outlined around income inequality and the risk of a K-shaped recovery. We have not yet solved a lot of the demographic issues. So there's still a lot of structural challenges, many structural challenges that we need to address. And we shouldn't think that we're out of the woods now that aggregate demand will be back up. But I think that to your specific question about what to me is the most important question is really defining what a worker is. What is an employee? What has become clear is that, although on paper you could have 10,000 full-time employees, but you can very easily have 100,000 subcontractors. During the pandemic, we had to, as business leaders, understand that delineation was a falsehood. And I think as governments and business leaders think about the recovery and think about how digitization and remote working are going to become even more central to the discussion of who a worker is, I do think that this is the big issue. It leads to questions around mental illness, mental challenges, and who's going to pay for those costs. It leads to more stark brings into more stark relief the questions around retooling and reskilling workers in a world that we know is becoming more technologically focused. And so, who exactly are your workers? How do we define those workers? And what does that mean in terms of obligations for business leaders and for government? I think is really the central question. And from that, all the other aspects around worker advocacy, around mental health, et cetera, emanate from there.
Do you think that we've seen a shift? I mean, obviously, we talk about we've seen this enormous fiscal response by governments everywhere, which has expanded the role of government in a kind of classic expenditure way. But also, I think you see just more creeping, or you could just say active involvement by governments in the economy. The companies that they've lent to, they're now going to have a bigger role, want to guide what they're doing a bit more because they gave them a massive loan in the middle of the recession. Lots of ways in which government is potentially going to be more influential. Is that something that we've got used to thinking that businesses should run away from that and have tirades against it? But is it something that potentially they could welcome, trying to solve some of these issues? What's a worker? It's governments that are going to have to really answer that question, isn't it?
Well, I think it's what you're getting at is a very important question. On the one hand, I am a big believer in market liberalism, and that we do want corporations to be at the tip of the spear of innovation. We know, if you look at some of the Fortune estimates, that the top companies in the United States, for example, are employing 30 million workers. They're big contributors, not just for innovation and R&D, but also in terms of tax base, in terms of investment. So they play a critical role, no doubt about it. In fact, I think the estimate is that their revenues are 2/3 of US GDP. So it's really important that we get corporations firing on all cylinders. But I think it's also critically important that governments provide a backdrop that makes companies perform at their highest levels. What does that look like? That just is not just about taxes and regulation. Of course, those are the levers that governments have, but it also means that governments need to be very intentional in terms of providing an environment that encourages innovation. So if you look back in history, the US government was absolutely front and center in the development of the Manhattan Project, DARPA, Silicon Valley. I'm afraid to say we don't see much of that in the West. And, if we look at what the people don't like the idea of an industrial policy, but I think that sort of partnership and seeing government working hand in hand to think about the future and be visionary is an important place for government. And that has been ceded to a sort of a vacuum, if I'm honest about it. We look at places like China, who are so explicit about what their visions are, and we sort of find it a little bit cringeworthy and perhaps anti-liberalism. But I think that we are overemphasizing the sort of delineation between government and private sector at a time when we actually need them to be working in concert and together. And history tells us that that is the best way to get not only improvements in society, but an expansion in GDP and the growth pie.
It's interesting. It's that the UK has not been very strategic in its industrial policy, but there's one area that it had actually been quite strategic, and that was the vaccination development, and that's worked out quite well. If only they'd applied some of the same strategy in others areas, but they had put money into basic R&D, all these things that don't always happen. But just going back to that crucial question about what is an employee, though, I mean, how is that something that companies have to decide for themselves in their individual case, or is it something where we need to be thinking about a whole new paradigm, and that's governments in fundamentally setting the rules for that?
Well, I think that government is becoming much more involved in some respects. It's a little bit early days, but we're hearing from the SEC and other regulatory bodies that they're interested in worker audits. If you serve on boards and you've served on the audit committee of boards, you know that we already do a lot of capital audits. We're required to present financials every quarter. So there's a lot of emphasis on the capital allocation and capital as a resource. But we haven't really been guided by regulation and government in terms of workers. How do we define worker productivity? What are the sort of things that we should be thinking about in terms of worker engagement and enjoyment of being in the workplace? And so those aspects are definitely things that regulators are thinking about. The SEC has been talking a lot about this, and I think that that's a place where government could lead. But I will say, even if they don't, the reality is that corporations are responding to the general zeitgeist, the mood music of the way we are living now, and that is also pointing us in the direction of being much more thoughtful about workers and more generally stakeholders.
And when we're thinking about issues around work-life balance and the mental health of employees coming out of this, what are the watchwords for companies if they're trying to do the right thing coming out of this? A lot of companies are saying they don't really want people to be staying at home, but there's clearly a demand from a lot of workers. How are you going to walk that line?
So, Stephanie, I think the words that come to my mind are trade-offs. I think one of the problems that I see from the boardroom, but more generally from the decision-making challenges that boardrooms and companies have to make, is that for pretty much any issue that we're dealing with, whether it's climate change, pay equity, gender and racial diversity, aspects of worker advocacy, data privacy. I mean, you take your pick of these big issues that we're grappling with. They all have trade-offs. And I love something that President Obama said. I'm paraphrasing here, but by the time something hit his inbox, it meant it was very difficult, because if it were easy, somebody else would solve it. And that's very true for boardrooms as well. We get a lot of these issues on what I would call the cultural frontier, ESG issues, that people think are easy to solve. If they were, somebody else would have solved them. They're incredibly challenging. And of course, issues around workers, as it falls squarely in that pile, because we don't know what the answer is. On the one hand, we are very sensitive. There's heightened sensitivity around work-life balance, for sure. And the truth is, it's basically, there's no utility for a company to have workers that are going to underperform. That's of no value if you're taking a very utilitarian aspect to this question. But at the same time, there are targets and things that need to get done. And very often, in some cases, that requires much more collaboration. And so having people work from home is not something that would be ideal, not just for the company's goals, but also for the individual's goals. It might be harder to see how they're contributing. It might be harder. It's the sort of traditional FaceTime kind of, needing to be in the office to be seen. And I'm not suggesting at all that those are not areas for improvement. But what I am saying is that there are some jobs and some tasks that require people to be in the office, and their productivity increases in multiple forms by being in those spaces. And so I don't think there's an answer that will cover everybody. And I can only assure you that we are thinking about it, because certainly COVID has revealed that we can run companies with people sitting at home, but we do need to do a lot of work on figuring out whether that's the ideal model, given that people have many different tasks and terms of reference.
And you mentioned at the start, if we sort of broaden the lens a bit, that we've a lot of the inequalities that were evident before, but maybe perhaps more also somewhat hidden behind the surface, have been unburied by COVID, and would be harder to ignore, whether at a company level or a government level. How do you respond as someone who's been very vocal on these issues for many years? You see ESG now as like the flavor of the month. Some people talk about an ESG bubble. How does a how can a company do the right thing on that? Make sure that they're doing the right things under that banner of ESG rather than just being on a bandwagon?
It's a wonderful question, and it kind of touches on what I mentioned a moment ago. I think that one of the problems is that we have been led, and society as a whole has been led by a lot of narratives, a lot of PR and politicization of ESG issues, when in fact these are complex issues with very long-term. Not only are they, in terms of multiple time horizons, but they have multiple stakeholders. We're getting pulled in different directions, and I'll give you an example in a moment. But the fundamental point is that we need all hands on deck to solve these problems, and yet ESG has led to massive fractures between groups. You hear about defunding energy companies. You hear about people, worker advocacy, leaving employees pitted against their employers. And yet, this is, to me, it seems very short-sighted and actually leading down a path that is not what ESG is meant to be delivering in the first place. Very quick example of this: there are 1.5 billion people who don't have access to energy in the planet today in a cost-effective, sustainable way. And at the same time, we're talking about defunding the energy companies who really are not only investing in a whole area of new green and clean alternatives, but also we want more diversity in institutions and organizations. Well, how will you get the diversity if you don't have this 1.5 billion people being educated? There are lots of aspects of the debate that to me seem very short-sighted. They are not all-encompassing. They don't consider, and I picked on climate change, but it's very true for areas such as diversity. We want to pick the best talent, and that's the only way we're going to succeed. But we should not be fighting inequality with inequality. We have to be sensitive to that. And so there are many aspects of this, to me, are not sophisticated enough in terms of the discourse around the need to think about trade-offs and to bring everybody, civil society, government regulators, and corporations to the table to really think about what these long-term sustainable solutions might look like.
I was smiling slightly listening to you with some of your answers, because it strikes me as someone who started off writing about the challenges of development assistance and development aid. One finds again and again that the problems that you face there actually are repeated in advanced economies and in companies. I can see how you find that's a very useful grounding to be helping companies.
Well, you're right, Stephanie, because ultimately it boils down to good intentions that generate bad outcomes. And that's, you're absolutely right, is a very regular theme in our lives. And we end up with policies that actually not only are not solving the problem, but they're actually making things worse. And I'm really trying to get ahead of that, because we can do better. We can put a man on the moon. Why can't we solve these problems in a way that's equitable and sustainable? And it's deeply, very much at the core, as you just pointed out, of how I see the world.
Well, it's the first principle of do no harm. If only we could follow that, and other things might follow. Okay, I'm going to put you on the spot with a final question, which takes things back to what really matters, which is, of course, productivity. As a macroeconomist, we know it all comes down to productivity in the end, at least in terms of how fast the global economy is going to grow, what the potential is for increasing the livelihoods and standards of living. We've had a long period of very low productivity growth. All the things that you've been talking about, digitization, change, acceleration of many changes by COVID, does that translate more government involvement and spending? For you, does that translate into a world where we might see higher productivity, more growth potential than you had expected before, or actually one where the problems become more and more serious and the growth becomes lower and lower?
Well, I certainly hope we see more productivity. As you know, given your background, productivity explains somewhere between 50 and 60% of why one country grows and another one does not. As you just pointed out, we've had at least about a decade now of low productivity, particularly in developed economies. And this has been a huge drag, as we've seen in economic growth, both for developed as well as developing economies. I very much hope that the aspects and the inputs into productivity do spur a renewed sort of spurt of economic growth. But the truth of the matter is I'm deeply concerned about a more progressive and aggressive agenda that could actually discourage investment. We've already seen a lot of corporations increasing dividends, increasing share buybacks, and not being encouraged to reinvest in the economies. It's a breaking up of companies. It's another point for debate. But fundamentally, any progressive era that chokes off growth, really around taxes, around regulation, to me is of greater worry in terms of contributing to a drag on growth. And the reality is that the short-termism embedded in society is the problem.